So thank you so much, Greg, for joining us. Your title, Complexity, Institutions, Money and the Commons. So Dr. Greg Fisher is a complexity science expert with a background that spans the public sector, Bank of England, the private sector, chief strategist at a macro hedge fund, the think tank world, chief economist, and in academia, doing his PhD on complexity economics. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Greg. And I think since we don't have Louise, we might just go through everyone and have the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tarang, and it's good to be here. And I'm very glad to say that everything, because I've organised this presentation the last couple of days, and everything I said is pretty much consistent with everything anyone has said so far in the last few presentations. Which is kind of nice. Okay, so I'm going to talk about complexity economics and focusing on a couple of things, which is the bigger picture, and a focus on money are the two main things I'm going to talk about. But first of all, I need to explain to you what I'm talking about when I say complexity. And complexity economics is the application of complexity science to economics. So what is complexity science for those people who don't know what this is? It's a horrible term, but basically I would reduce it to this, if I'm going to be overly simplistic: the study of interconnected evolving systems. So you can think of just system science. Okay, it is the study of how systems work. Okay, there's a slight difference between complexity and systems thinking, which I won't go into, but it's broadly the same thing. So that's where we start. There are three different ways of describing complexity science. The history is one of the ways. And this is a big field now. It goes back about 80 years to the 1940s. There's this map that was produced in 2021. I'm not going to go through this in detail. I'm just going to show you it exists. There are about 5 different subdisciplines called systems theory, dynamical systems theory, artificial intelligence is a part of this, and cybernetics. So it's a huge field, and there are probably something like 60 to 70 academic departments across the world today studying this subject. It is enormous, thousands of researchers, but very few people have heard of it. And there are in fact about 12 research institutions in this country focusing on complexity science. The second way of describing complexity is a bag of concepts, right? And I've listed a few here: emergence, self-organization, path dependence, autopoiesis, ergodicity. So if you go onto Santa Fe Institute's website, which is kind of like the mecca of complexity science, they have about 100 odd different concepts that they define within a glossary. So you can also see it as a bag of concepts. My preferred way of doing this is to talk about the ontology of complexity science. And I've written this phrase here, which is it's an understanding of how the universe is patterned and in a continual sort of process of repatterning. Okay, so I can talk about what I mean by that in a little bit more detail. By patterns, I'd give examples of technology, for example, where it kind of like creates patterns of relationships between things, laws, social norms, governance structures, etc. Those are patterns because you create relationships between things. And there's 2 schools that emerged within complexity science. This is from Edgar Morin: restricted complexity and general complexity. And broadly speaking, restricted complexity is complexity science done a little bit in the old-fashioned sort of way of doing classical science. It's still a bit atomistic, a bit reductionistic. Whereas general complexity is a bit more philosophically sophisticated, and that's sort of what Edgar Morin detailed 20 years ago. I'm very much in the general complexity side of things, but I respect that there's a place for both of these different schools. The last thing to say on this slide is that I thoroughly recommend this book, which has been published recently. I had the honor of being part of enabling it to happen. I helped Gene with different bits and pieces. It's called The Tao of Complexity by Gene Bolton, and it discusses a broad shift from a machine-based understanding of reality, of the universe, to one that is about patterns and processes. And this is a fantastic book, I honestly, and it's very accessible. You don't need to be an expert in anything really to read this, although it is, it does dive into things like quantum theory and very it's a wide-ranging field of things, but it's made up of 76 different essays that are kind of interconnected, but you can kind of read them individually. So that is a book I would recommend, and a lot of the things I'm going to say in the next 10, 15 minutes are very compatible with this book. Okay, so I said I'm going to talk about two broad things. One is the big picture, and I know Bronwyn has done this a bit, but also James. And I think everything I'm going to say here is compatible with both. So what I will do in the next two slides is unpack this point. The machine worldview, think of the society as a machine, is embedded social science so heavily, including economics and management science, that it's led to a centralization of authority and responsibility across the board, right? Both within government structures, within civil service, within the state, within corporations. You've basically got centralization and treating human systems as if they're machines. And we've taken this from classical science. So I'm going to unpack this point, and obviously that creates a tension with localism and commons as well for different reasons. I'm going to unpack this point within this slide, and the next slide I'll try and sort of say something about, well, what do we do? We start off with classical science after the Enlightenment, or kind of that came out of the Enlightenment, which treated or thought about the universe as a machine. Okay, so it's mechanistic, and you get these three words again from Moran, where he talked about determinism, where you get cause and effect, reductionism, where you basically say you can understand whole systems by breaking them into parts and understanding the parts. And there's disjunction he means here, which is basically research becomes silo-based. Right, economists don't talk to psychologists. Right, sociologists don't talk to psychologists. Yada yada. It's all silo-based. Okay, which we talked about over lunch. Very important parts of classical science. When you take this into social science, then you basically, the view is that actually social system ought to have the laws which are knowable in principle, like natural laws, that don't change over time and are that spatially also don't vary. Okay, so all different regions. Okay, so this is a very broad abstract point, and it's a massive generalization. There's lots of social science that gets away from this. But within economics, for example, which is obviously dominant within Western social science, you get these principles of let's find the laws that are unchanging and homogeneous everywhere. And it also gives rise to this idea that the systems are controllable. Okay, so they're basically machines. So you need to find the buttons and the levers to press and pull, and then you can kind of you can get to your solutions. And if you add the economies of scale to this idea, then you basically get to a picture that the machine is controllable by the center, by some people that are specialized to control it. For example, ministers in around a cabinet. And it's ubiquitous. So it's not just within political philosophies, I would argue. You can see it in the Labour Party historically, the Conservative Party historically, and you've also seen it across sort of socialism and nationalism. Both things lead to centralization, if you think about it. But you also see it within economics and classical management science as well. Management science has come comfortably away from this idea. It's one of the best sort of fields in the Western social sciences for getting away from it, but it's still embedded, and it's embedded in just a lot of our own mental models. Okay, Sue talked earlier about kind of repatterning our minds, and I think that's crucial. It's embedded in all of us, including me, this idea. So it leads to a centralization of government and the economy. And I like to think of the phrase the Magnificent Seven. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. This is Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Nvidia, Microsoft, etc. There are 7 huge companies now. And interestingly, Tesla's in there, but I would replace that with Elon Musk. And I want to really emphasize from a complexity point of view, from an economics point of view, people like Adam Smith and Hayek did not intend this. They did not intend this horrendous centralized economic system.
And it leads to this, I think a lot of us understand this, it leads to an extractive economy, where the center extracts from the periphery in a broad sense, but also the present extracts from the future as well. We have finite resources and we're plundering them at a hell of a rate of knots. And it's going to come back on us in some way, or come back on humanity at some point in some way. So we end up with a disposable, non-circular economy. Okay. And at the core, I mean, I studied economics at Cambridge. I worked for the Bank of England for 9 years. Okay, I understand orthodoxy, and it is blind to a lot of these things, right? And if it's blind, basically, John Maynard Keynes, as some of you might know this, he basically said, if something doesn't really have property rights, it's ignored. Okay, it doesn't have power, right? And that's kind of how it's ignored. But it also gives rise to the polycrisis. Okay, so all these multiple crises are going on. I think you can trace back to this machine worldview. I should say that also that I'm not saying the machine worldview is responsible for everything horrendous going on in this world. I think there's also power issues that are kind of obviously important, obviously. But I want to make sure that I'm just not sounding naive, that I think it's just a mindset problem. There are also people that are exploiting their position of power. What does this all mean for localism and the commons? I'm just saying at this stage, the machine metaphor underlies all of this, and it's difficult. Okay, so that's a very bleak picture, and I was actually thinking that's horrendously bleak, but James was even bleaker, I thought, which I say to James with love and respect. But so here I want to kind of unpack a little bit the question of kind of what do we do, because this is big picture stuff, so it's kind of hard, a bit abstract. And there is some light at the end of the tunnel. I think actually we are going too slowly through a new enlightenment, okay? And complexity science, I think, is a part of that. And it's shifting away from the kind of reductionist mindset that came out of the sort of European Enlightenment a few hundred years ago, and it's understanding systems that are interconnected. I think that's part of it. I think complexity science is a part of it. It's not kind of the only thing. There are other philosophies, like James, I don't think would see himself as a complexity scientist, but everything he said, I think, sits beautifully alongside it. So there's some light, and I would mention that book I said earlier, The Tao of Complexity. It's fantastic. So a couple of implications I want to unpack a little bit. One is that we need to be thinking in systemic terms. Okay, the fundamental problem is that we're not thinking about the interconnectivity of everything. So the world is going through problems that James explained. It needs to be repatterned, governance, management, and institutions. But also there's a meta issue here. Doesn't just need to be repatterned to deal with today's kind of crucial, critical problems. It also we need democratic systems that enable continuous repatterning, right? So we want democratic systems across the world that allow us to kind of just transform our systems in 100 years' time to the present challenges of those times. So that we've kind of got two. One is a more concrete, what do we do now? And the other one is, how do we continuously transform our systems? And the second one, obviously, beautifully, I'm so glad James mentioned this, and we have not coordinated at all, is subsidiarity. Right? I think this is a fantastically important concept, and it's great he mentioned it too. And for those unfamiliar or didn't hear James when he said it, I'm defining it here as decisions and actions should be handled at the most local level, capable of addressing them effectively. And if we applied that to this country and most countries, it would lead to a net devolution of authority and responsibility. I say net because, like James said, some of it kind of has to shift upwards. So a lot of the kind of planetary issues require responsibility and authority to be shifted sort of to the transnational level. Okay, so my wife told me to rewrite this bullet point, which I have. And I don't want to be too political, but when it comes to subsidiarity, who do you vote for, right? Which party are you a member of? Okay, because if subsidiarity is so crucial, and both James and I are saying it, I have to say the Labour and Conservative parties don't have very good track records. They're both centralists, okay? I know this is quite contentious. I know that Gordon Brown wrote a report in 2022, which is all about subsidiarity and yada, yada, yada. But the Conservatives had the big society, which was their effort, and that failed. My guess is actually the Labour Party are going to go through the same thing because they don't have a political philosophy that supports it. Okay, there are too many people in the Labour and Conservative parties that are centralists, and they will stop. And the Liberal Democrats are the only party that consistently promoted devolution for many decades. Okay, and yes, I'm a Liberal Democrat, but that's ultimately because I'm a subsidiarity supporter, and they're the only ones really that kind of seem credible about it. So the big question for me is whether the Brown Commission can succeed where the big society failed. Incidentally, I was chief economist of the think tank that was orientated around the big society, even though I was a Liberal Democrat, and basically got out because it was just fraud. The two other things I'd mention in terms of what we do, I'd say the World Wide Web and also our smartphones are still incredibly powerful for creating communities and connecting, disintermediating centralized power. So get online, make connections, build communities is another implication of a lot of these things. And in fact, over lunch, we were talking about just using WhatsApp groups, right, to kind of create communities. It's wonderful for creating communities. I even created a WhatsApp group last week that was entitled, "Oh no, not another WhatsApp group," because I get so many. But anyway, but the other thing I actually didn't put on here is China using the current system in its to do what you need. What I mean by that is, in fact, Bronwyn referred to it earlier, is like if you've got some local initiative, where you can, create a legal boundary around it, okay, create property rights around it, use the law to basically say, I'm protecting this thing here, okay? Try and use local government or national governments to help you to do that. But use the mechanisms of the current system where you can to protect what you're doing. And Bronwyn talked about, kind of creating rights and responsibilities around something. But that's an additional thought I had this morning that I didn't write down here. So the final thing I want to talk about is about currencies, because this is something I know a fair amount about, having worked at the Bank of England, and my PhD was in the area of institutional economics as well as complexity science. So there are many noble efforts, and I genuinely mean great efforts to create alternative currencies, in which I would include crypto in, ranging from the very local, and Sue talked about the Brixton and Bristol efforts, the pounds, and also James Gilligan proposed a global reserve currency about 12 years ago in an excellent paper, which I fully support, and I think these are great. But I think in general, the aim of these currencies is to counter the problems I've already discussed, that the system isn't working for people on the ground. Okay, so we want to keep wealth local instead of it being extracted. We want to devolve economic power. So James's promotion of a global reserve currency is basically to counter the dollar being a reserve currency, which creates incredible financial instabilities, but also the purposes of environmental sustainability and the commons, etc. So these are great efforts, and I think those are the sort of general aims, is because we have such a bad system that they try to do that. But what I want to do is take a step back and first of all mention, from my PhD studies and what I read, there are two different types of collective action problems, and currencies or money sits within one of those. Okay, there's type 1 collective action problems are coordination problems. Okay, so a good example is whether we drive on the left or right. Okay, so all collective action problems are pretty much either coordination problems, which I'm calling type 1, or type 2 cooperation problems. And they're very different beasts. So the tragedy of the commons points to a cooperation problem. The prisoner's dilemma in game theory, for those familiar with it, is a cooperation type problem, type 2. And the main difference between these is that with coordination problems, once you've achieved some sort of solution, nobody wants to change, right? It's self-sustaining, right? If we all drive on the left, nobody in their right mind is going to drive on the right. Okay, so these mechanisms are self-sustaining. That's not the case with cooperation problems. You often need rules and regulations and an enforcement mechanism. Okay, and Ellen Ostrom's work was very much about that because they were commons-related problems. And I mention this, and by the way, some of the great philosophers in history, like David Hume and Friedrich Hayek, thought that collective action problems were broadly coordination problems, type 1. Right, and those are really easy to sort. You just kind of basically declare a solution, and then everyone keeps to it. So Hayek, a key problem in his work is he didn't really address the more difficult challenge of cooperation problems. And I mention this because money is a cooperation problem, but it's treated as a coordination problem. So it's a type 2 problem because it has an inherent quality challenge. We have the potential for fraud and inflation and other things. Okay, a lot of people frame money as if it's a type 1 problem. Hayek did this in the 1970s. He was talking about the denationalization of money. He just thought banks could create money from scratch and people would kind of choose. He didn't understand the quality problem well enough. So the reason I mention this is that any new currency needs a mechanism to guarantee quality. It kind of sounds obvious and commonsensical when I say it like this, but a lot of people in the crypto world, not everyone in the crypto world, I think don't get this, and Hayek certainly didn't. So to create a new currency, you've got to have some sort of mechanism, including a peg to the real economy. Okay, because that creates sort of quality. And the contrast I use here is Bitcoin versus Libra, which you might remember is Facebook's cryptocurrency. One of my friends was actually responsible, was on the team that created it. Bitcoin has mostly a quality problem because it goes through bouts of inflation and deflation. Okay, it's just a horrendous currency to use in everyday exchanges. Whereas Libra was basically pegged to the real economy through other currencies. Okay, so that's just, I thought I'd add that slide as for people who are trying to think about currencies, that it's essential that new currencies overcome the quality problem. So that's it. The last thing I would say is just to come back to this. A lot of things I've said are unpacked beautifully in this book. Thank you.
Thank you.